Welcome to the Writers Center's virtual craft chat series, where we chat with authors a little bit less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the artistic director at the Writers Center. I'm also a novelist, and I also did some subject research into the history that is that's in this book we're going to be talking about. So I'm really excited to have what's for me a very interesting conversation about the project. So it's my pleasure to welcome Constance Hays Matsumoto to the Writers Center's virtual stage. And Connie, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for sharing the book with us. So do you have a copy of your book handy to maybe do a little just brief sample from?
I do, yeah. This is the book. It's titled Of White Ashes. And it's co-authored between my husband and me. My husband's name is Kent. And the book is inspired by the true stories of Kent's parents. So I'm going to read from the chapter titled Tule Lake. And in this chapter, Ruby, who is one of the main characters, and her family have recently arrived in the Tule Lake high security segregation camp in Tule Lake, California. Before going to Tule Lake, they were in Jerome, Arkansas, in a camp there for just over a year. And this is an excerpt from Ruby's diary. May 30th, 1944. Dear diary, they closed school this afternoon to remember and honor the service personnel who died while serving in the armed forces. Beyond the gates, I imagine families are enjoying fried chicken and potato salad picnics, attending parades, and visiting grave sites of loved ones. But in here, we are one day closer to resuming the lives we took for granted. Hopefully, anyway. We're totally out of touch with the outside world. How do people adapt to the daily routines of being stuck inside these fences? It's weird, but some do. I won't, not ever. Time and space have changed, and yet many of the kids in my high school act as though everything's okay. I guess they've accepted being locked up, and it doesn't bother them. Nincompoops. But the frustration grows outside of school. They assigned additional troops here, and soldiers are everywhere, inside and outside of the fences. The real thugs with loyalty to Japan have become violent and beat up and harass those loyal to America. I see bloodied men lying in the dirt or making their way homes beaten and battered after being terrorized. I hope Father stays out of it all. I think he will. He's busy with his art and poetry and sermon writing. But I don't get why he's writing sermons he might never deliver again. One thing I know for sure, I won't get used to being stuck in this dark chapter. I am an American, and they stole my freedom from me. We're not in here for our own protection. We're in here because our leaders got entangled in hysteria and trampled on our civil liberties. To hell with complacency. I want out.
Thank you so much. So in your own words, who are you?
I am a mother, a wife, a grandmother, and I consider myself a bit of a serial change artist, actually, because I have taken so many diverse paths over my lifetime and my professional work. I spent years in working for big companies in human resources and organizational development before leaving that behind to go into interior design, where I owned an interior design firm for 10 years before closing that to focus on writing and writing this book.
Thank you. I appreciate many paths. I've had the same background a little bit too. So not the same stuff, but the same type of background, I should say. I've never had an interior design firm.
It's fun.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like me and my partner are okay at interior design, but we've never done it. Maybe new career change. That's the next one.
There you go.
Yeah. So the first question we like to ask all our guests is, maybe some people love it and some people hate it, so I hope you fall into the love it category, is what's a question you really wish someone would ask about your writing or writing practice? In other words, what haven't you gotten to speak about before?
Yeah, a lot of questions have been around what inspired the book and the process, and a whole lot of kind of normal questions. But one that hasn't surfaced is, how was the book structured? And I don't know how other writers structure their books, but I developed my own way, basically pulling from lots of different sources on how to go about structuring a book to structure of White Ashes.
Okay, so what is the structure then?
Okay, so it's basically, I think about it like building a house. You have to have a foundation and what's going to support and underpin the house. And for this book, it was really history and historical events moving in time from 1939 to 1958. So it spans, a long period of time with major events in there. The bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese-American incarceration, the bombing of Hiroshima, the surrender, the release of people from the camp, and getting back into life. And so all of these were what I considered like the tent poles, these major events. And then the story was really about crafting scenes that really got at how did the characters move through that time and how did it feel for them to move through that time. And so I developed this worksheet. You're not going to be able to see anything about it except that it's a really big worksheet. And some of the things on this worksheet, and this worksheet was like the big kind of like overall strategy for each of the two main characters. And then something like this became a flip chart, and then it became multiple flip charts as the project grew over time. But at the bottom of it is time. And then these are, kind of like separated into acts. And the plot goals, the orange things here are, the pivotal events, the tent poles. And then this green area here, these are scene goals. And, they're, because I don't outline, but I definitely don't wing it. You can tell by looking at this that I don't wing anything. The thought of doing that just makes me crazy. But using this as a guide to make sure that I had the setting nailed and what was the character's goal for that particular scene, and what were the hiccups and how did they handle that, and then how did they recover. So all of those things are built into this document. And I'll show you something else that's like really huge. This is just one period of time that sort of morphed into this for just maybe, I don't know, this could have just been a 1-year period. And all of these Post-it notes were placed in the white space to just capture ideas and the way that scenes would unfold as I brainstormed what they would be like with Kent.
That's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. You have color coordination, and you might also be a detective tracking a serial killer. Like I had that, like the scene, like the strings going piece to piece there. That was, I was already amazed you just had the normal size sheet of paper up. Like, that's like color coordinated. It's so neat. Then you like pulled out the poster. Like, what just happened? That's amazing. Okay, I'm gonna be sitting with that for a while and questioning my own process forever as inadequate after seeing the rigor there. That's amazing. You should write something about that process, and like with some photos of the stuff. That would be an amazing thing to. Yeah, that's amazing. I might have more questions about that later. I may have to come back once it sits. I just call you on the phone and ask questions later, because I feel like they may not come now, but I have more questions about that process. That's amazing. So one of the things about the book that's most obvious and most striking is that it is a collaborative process with you and your husband Kent. And I've rarely written with someone else. I used to say I've never done it, and my partner did remind me that we did once write an academic essay together. So I've, I think, once written collaboratively. So how did the collaborative process really work? Who does what and at what stages, and how does like how much back and forth, and when does the back and forth occur?
Yeah, it didn't start out that way at all. It evolved over time and became different over time. In the beginning, this was my project alone. I had closed the business. Kent was still working full time. He still is working full time. And I dove into the deep end of learning craft, of researching history, and beginning to write the manuscript. And so it was a couple of years into it. And all of this really escalated during COVID, when we were together more in the house, that he became more involved in the project. I mean, he was always editing pages, and certainly this is about his family. Kent's Japanese American. He was the cultural lens for the book. But then he became more involved in brainstorming scenes, and in really having the time, because he wasn't commuting. So he had an extra 2 hours in his day to really partner with me in thinking about, well, would that word have worked? Using a particular abbreviation for like grandfather, would it have worked in this book? And no, it wouldn't have worked, because people who know Japanese language would have been all thrown out of the book by that point if they had read this word that we wanted to use. So yeah, that was really it. We researched together, we traveled together, we went to Hiroshima, we visited the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, where the G7 was just a couple of weeks ago. We stood across the river from where Kent's father worked in a rifle factory when he was 16 years old in Hiroshima. His education was disrupted by the Japanese military. He was conscripted out of school to build rifles for the emperor. We went to Hawaii, and we visited the island where his mom was born, and where she lived until she was 12. Before she went to Arkansas. Her father was a Buddhist minister, and he ministered to the local plantation, sugar cane plantation community. And we got to meet local people there. So we had been to both of these places before, but we weren't looking at these places through the lens of writing a book.
What was what was rewarding, or the most rewarding part of that process? What came away once the collaboration started in earnest? What was like rewarding about that? What was great? And were there any difficulties or frustrations in I'm sure, a peaceful, friendly, nice way, but were there great parts of it? Were there any difficult parts of it doing that collaborative process?
There really weren't any difficulties. We get along really well. Like I can think of, we've been married 25 years, and I can think of like maybe 5 times that we had like a serious argument about anything. So we just sort of work together anyway. But with this, Of White Ashes at its core is a love story. It's a love story between these people who are Japanese American, who love the United States. So, love of country, who love each other, who fall in love with each other and love each other. And somebody pointed out to Kent and me recently that this is really a love story between us, because we took the love that we had for his parents and we created this book out of love for them. And I think it really strengthened who we are together. And something unexpected that happened was forming a common purpose for the two of us. And that is to really help use this book and who knows if we can do this really, but certainly our goal is to further the mission of the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages Organization, which promotes pilgrimages to the different sites of incarceration across the country, and we're donating a portion of our proceeds of the book to them. But beyond that, maybe this book, if we're out there and we're talking about it with the right audiences, has the ability to lower the temperature a little bit, maybe have someone think a little differently before they react to someone who doesn't look like them or talk like them or think like them. Because, Lord knows there's a whole lot of division in our country right now.
So that leads me to my next question a little bit, which I think it's very important to reshare the pieces of history included in the novel. I mean, they're incredibly important pieces of history, and certainly like the details of the bombing in Hiroshima are so horrific that and have been certainly sort of swept under the rug, so to speak, in American history. But at the same time, it's a novel, and the novels exist, and you mentioned the love story. That's the core of the thing. There's the history, but the core of the thing is the characters and the experiences they have. So there's sort of this balance between, in a book like this, the narrative versus the didactic. You do want it to be an educational piece, but if it's just talking at the person, no one's going to keep reading. So how do you educate a reader while not turning a novel into a textbook?
Well, that's where we really relied on the structuring it around the true events, but that the story was about the characters. And many of the character stories are true. They really happened to Kent's mom or father. But there was a great attempt to get inside of them and help the reader to experience what it might have felt like to be a 12-year-old girl going off to incarceration from her idyllic island in Hawaii to, cold Jerome, Arkansas, or his father to be a boy in militaristic Japan and have a nuclear bomb dropped on your city. So it was really about getting inside of the character and how they processed what was going on.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the relevance of the historical events, and just this isn't necessarily a craft question, but I think it's important to mention why are those historical moments so relevant today? What can we learn from them that we need to learn from them?
Well, we started working on this book during the Muslim ban, and when at the beginning of the Southern border crisis. And, throughout this period of time, we started in 2017, the country's become increasingly divided, and the culture wars are really coming to blows, with people canceling out each other's beliefs. And so that's why it's relevant today on, the injustice piece, incarcerating people solely based on race. On the Hiroshima side, we have Putin, who is threatening, and his actions in Ukraine have been just horrendous. And then to continue threatening nuclear warfare, it's really quite unnerving. So it's very relevant today, and we all should be paying attention to this. I don't know if you're familiar with the doomsday clock, but the doomsday clock is closer to midnight now than it has ever been. It's 90 seconds to midnight. In, I think, 1990, early 1990s, 1991, it was 17 minutes to midnight. Midnight meaning nuclear catastrophe, doomsday. And so that's very real and something that we should all be paying attention to and doing whatever we can to help tone that down.
So when I was researching the bombing in Hiroshima, the details are so horrific, and and the devastation and the death is staggering. And it was psychologically harmful for me to do that work. So how did you take care of yourself? I mean, going into this research process? Because I'm just remembering, sorry, I didn't send you this question in advance, but like, I'm just remembering that was such a horrible research process. Necessary maybe, but still horrible. And you sort of do have to take care of yourself, because if you don't, you're going to just be depressed and not be able to even write. So how did you take care of yourself in the worst parts of this research?
Well, part of the time I spent recovering from ankle reconstruction surgery, where I'm actually, in our guest room on the first floor with my laptop and, maps and, all this stuff around me. But it was hard. It was really, really hard. I remember reading John Hersey's Hiroshima when I was in high school, and, reading about people that vaporized. And I just could not get my head around that. Like, I couldn't imagine, how does somebody just disappear like that? And so I stopped imagining it then, because it was too hard to imagine it. So I stopped. I just didn't. But in this process, I really had to. And yeah, it was hard. But really, during COVID, I was probably taking better care of myself than I was at other times. We were home more, we were eating better. I was exercising every day. So I really do think that helped.
Right, thank you. So another thing that's interesting for me, because my first novel was an alternate history of the Soviet space program. So I could make up more because it was not based on real history, but I did have lots of real historical research. And I'm interested in the difference between fact versus truth. A fact being a literal thing that actually did happen, could be added to the historical record, versus truth, which seems to me a little bit more the realm of the literary arts, where we're trying to get to something like wisdom or artistic, making art from the thing.
Mhm.
So many readers, though, want to know what was true in parts of my novel, but I didn't ever really think about that. It was not something I thought about while I was writing. Like, what's true versus like what's true, and they meant fact. And for me, well, everything is true to the novel, so it doesn't make a difference to me. And we had a previous craft chat with novelist Vanessa Hua, and she wrote, I believe that fiction flourishes where the official record ends, and that research should serve as the floor and not the ceiling of the imagination. I think that relates to your foundation comment earlier. Broadly, what's your relationship to what really happened to the historical record?
My personal relationship is conversations with my mother-in-law and my father-in-law, and them sharing with me, which is kind of unique, actually, things that they hadn't shared with their children. And so it was curious that was happening. And through the process, that I've come to realize that is, I think it's a generational thing, very typical of people who went through trauma in this period of time. It's also a cultural thing. But here I was, this outsider, and I was curious. And so I asked, and my mother-in-law would share stories with me, and they were true stories. I brought this to show because I haven't had it at other times, and I think it's important. This is a autograph book, and it's constructed out of scrap wood, and it's very delicate. But inside, with a wood burning pen, it says "My Diary," and this page here says Tule Lake, Newell, California, autographs, Reiko Odate. And this is filled with these sweet sentiments from her friends in high school. And reading through this, it really gave me a lot more insight into what she was like as a young girl. And then the same with her yearbook. So yeah, shocking, right? That you wouldn't think in camp they would have had a normal thing like a yearbook, but they did. And there's pictures of, glee clubs and pictures of classes and the students there. And this is annotated by her friends, which gave me even more insight into who she is. But she also wrote things down. She was a writer as well. She authored several children's books late in life. She was a third grade teacher for most of her life. And her books are still available on Amazon. They're beautifully illustrated, and they're really sweet stories that she loved from her childhood. But she also wrote down a family history for her children, talking about her own history, Kent's father's history, and shared that with all of us. And then when Julie Otsuka's book, When the Emperor Was Divine, came out, she read it and shared it with me. She did the same when Jamie Ford's book, On the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, came out. And then after I would read these books, she and I would talk about it, and she would tell me what was true and what wasn't true, in these books. So, I do have that firsthand from her. And the rest was research.
So what was your threshold of accuracy when recounting actual events? How far could you let yourself diverge from history for the sake of the narrative? And then maybe how much did you need to make up where you maybe had gaps, especially in personal histories where there isn't the history is the history, you can find the textbook, but for things that were about personal stories, obviously there must have been gaps you needed to fill in. How did that process work?
Well, the historical events are grounded in historical accuracy, and we take great pride in that. We weren't going to change history, and we weren't going to change history around attitudes and beliefs around that time either. It is what it was what it was. But we did have to make up a lot of things. And so, moving them through this long period of time, we didn't have all of those details from them. And so we did make up stories that seemed to make sense for the time and that fit who we believe their personalities truly are. So, for example, I am certified in Myers-Briggs, which is a personality assessment tool. And no, I didn't give my mother-in-law and father-in-law one of these tools to complete, but I have a pretty good idea of who they are, and then use that as a guide in developing their characters and how that character may have acted in a particular situation.
You seem like you're a very rigorous person with your rigor is really fascinating to me. You're so organized and just thinking of them in a very systematic way like that. So you had an idea before the characters went on the page how much did you know was going to happen, these characters were going to do before you even put something on the page? Was there ever did the characters ever surprise you, or did you all pretty much have control of these characters because you had thought about them so hard and analyzed, and I mean that in a looser sense than the word analyzed them so thoroughly before you began writing?
A couple of times I was surprised.
Mm-hmm.
But I did create detailed character descriptions for them, everything from their personality types to their beliefs and their fears and their values and their big, hairy, audacious goals in life. And so all of that was there to stay true to. But when the imagination takes over and the creative process is in gears, sometimes it took an unexpected path. For example, I didn't know how I was going to address the debate between whether or not these are internment camps, incarceration camps, or concentration camps. And that was easy. My mother-in-law and I had a conversation about it. She didn't believe that they were concentration camps. But they were not internment camps either, because that's factually wrong. Internment camps are places where foreign nationals go, non-American citizens. So they truly were incarcerated, and that is really the appropriate term to use today. But a scene developed around that, and it was one that I hadn't anticipated. And Kent and I had a blast pulling that together. It's a debate scene. So Ruby is in high school, and she's actually debating around this particular issue.
Okay. I'm glad to hear, because I'm definitely a writer who just waits for the surprises, to know that even in a rigorous process, surprises still happen. So that's refreshing for me to know. So one of the things that I think is definitely prominent in the book, and we've covered a little bit, is writing fictionally about family. And so my first question is, why did this become a novel instead of a piece of nonfiction?
A couple of reasons. I am a huge historical fiction reader. I love it. I've learned a lot from reading it. You know, just for example, those two books that I had conversations with my mother-in-law about. I also believe that fiction allows someone who otherwise wouldn't pick up a nonfiction book. It's something that they might enjoy reading, and they'll pick it up, and they're able to learn what it might have felt like to be the characters, and to imagine, you know, a very different world through the eyes of a child instead of through the lens of a historian.
Mhm.
And then there's also the family piece of it. We felt that it was the right decision for our family because the book did not start out to be a book that we were going to write. We didn't talk about that, but we years ago had hoped for a nonfiction writer that we know. He's in Maryland. He's an outstanding writer. He was interested in writing the book because since the day I met Kent, I have wanted this story to be told. And Kent's parents didn't want anything to do with him. And then we tried a documentary film route and they didn't want to go that route. And so then it became, okay, well then, you know, this is going to be something that we take on ourselves. And Kent has a brother and a sister, and, you know, they loved and respected their parents as well. And so we needed to be respectful of them and, you know, being clear that the way that we portrayed these characters and their flaws is a figment of our imagination. It's not who they are, who they were. They've since passed.
So this is a question that I guess I need to ask before the next one, which is, you sort of said you came to writing specifically for this project. Have you written other things with other characters? Is this really your first use of fictional characters in this way in this novel here?
This is, yeah. I really did. I dove into the deep end.
That's amazing. Is there, I mean, so this is maybe, do you have a sense then, since you haven't necessarily done another project that would be, you'd have to, as a point of comparison, was there anything you like an extra responsibility or extra challenges or what else did you have to do to get right, or at least feel like you were getting right these characters, since you owed it to the people themselves, to their family and friends and other relations?
Yeah, it's really about love, Zach. I loved them. I respected them, and what they were able to get beyond in their lives and achieve, and just their incredible resilience. And so, you know, love and respect for who they were really the guardrails for all of it.
Great, thank you. So I do want to remind everyone that we certainly welcome questions from the audience. So if you have a question at any point, just type it into the chat window. I have plenty to keep going with, but we certainly welcome questions. So just put those there and I'll get to them when I'm able. Another thing, and you hit on this a little bit earlier, was the role of contemporary perspective. That it's hard for me to reckon with the past using the better thinking of the present, because I mean, thinking has progressed and is always progressing. Sometimes it regresses, but I mean, there is an overarching thought that grows and changes and has morphed from this time. How do you use or consider a contemporary popular discourse maybe as a lens to look back at events from a time when such thinking wasn't as prominent?
Well, balancing these unacceptable overtones with the past with today's thinking is tough for sure. It really is. But I personally believe there's great danger in doing so, that we writers of historical moments have an obligation to not change history, but to learn from it. And this topic actually came up last week. I was at the Historical Novel Society conference, and a panel was talking about the difference between historian and writer, you know, of historical fiction. And the consensus among this panel, and I agree with them completely, is that changing attitudes in history with a modern perspective changes history, because these books actually become the history that people learn from. And so, yeah, I was pretty true to all of that, the good, bad, and the ugly, because it benefits all of us to recognize, in many ways, how far we've come from where we were.
So how did you come out of this process then? Was it educational for you personally to go through this process? And did you find your own understanding of this piece of history and its contemporary echoes increasing as you continued to write and think about the subject? And maybe as part two of that, is that then what you're hoping for by maintaining the historical thinking of the period, that a contemporary reader is going to get the same sort of revelations from reading the book that you got in the process of writing the book?
So for me personally, it was absolutely educational. As I said in the beginning, 25 years ago, when I met Kent and learned about his parents, I thought, that's a remarkable story. That is truly remarkable that these two ordinary people experienced these extraordinary circumstances. But it was a story. And going into this, I was thinking about the story. Coming out of it, I think about it quite differently. I do see this book and the work that I do with it going forward to be a platform for helping to educate people and to maybe change some hearts and minds along the way. And so when we started this process, we didn't even know about JAMP, the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages Organization. But having just returned, we were in Jerome, Arkansas with them in the first week of May. And for example, this is why their work is so important. There's very few elders that are left. So now it's the younger generations, their children and their grandchildren who are coming to these pilgrimages. So I met a woman there who was born in Jerome in the camp. She was born in 1943. And we were visiting the cemetery. That's all that's left in Jerome, by the way. There's nothing there. It's actually a private farm, but there's a cemetery and there's a smokestack that remains from where the hospital was. And so I saw her standing there looking at these 3 gravestones, and she was quite upset. And I walked over to her and she said, look, and I looked down at the stones and it said, infant 1943, infant 1943, infant 1943. They didn't even have names. And here I am with this woman, and that could have been her, but she lived. And so, furthering that mission has really become a mission for Kent and for me. And that was very unexpected and wasn't something that we set out to do.
Thank you. I want to jump ahead in my questions a little bit, because this is a question that seems like it maybe is growing of interest for me, is about influences, because you're in an interesting position where your literary influences are tied directly to this book in a lot of ways. But I'm also wondering, like, what literary influences you maybe brought prior to tackling the project. So what is your literary heritage? What are the books and who are the authors you think have most influenced you as a writer?
Well, as I said, I love reading historical fiction. I especially love reading World War II historical fiction, and I always have. I think those books explore the brutality of war and help to share how individuals are shaped and what their fate is because of what they lived through. So 2 in particular that have really been my favorites and influential for me are Anthony Doerr's All the Light We Cannot See and Kristen Hanna's The Nightingale. I actually was so taken by All the Light We Cannot See when I started working on this book. I deconstructed All the Light We Cannot See and went through the whole book and deconstruct it. What's the point of view here? What's the period of time? What's going on? Because it was just this masterpiece. It was just such a phenomenal book.
I've actually not read that book. I've read Doerr's stories, and he's certainly one of the best like writers on a sentence level there is right now too. So he's such a masterful writer and in control of everything. So absolutely, that's great. So a slightly different version of that question though would be, what books, I think we maybe get all that you cannot see, but what books is this project in conversation with? Is there a different answer to that question? Are there specific books that maybe other than those books that this book is conversing with, that it's entering the conversation with?
Oh yeah, so those books are the European side of the war, France. The books that resonate with Of White Ashes, I've already mentioned two, Julia Otsuka's When the Emperor Was Divine, Jamie Ford's On the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. And then a couple of others are Susan Meisner's The Last Year of the War. I think that book, of all of the books that I've read, she really captured the best what it was like to be a young teenage girl in the camps. Others are Kristen Kiefer's Bantams, which gets into the 442nd and coming home from war. Yeah, so those are a couple.
Great, thank you. So I did want to talk about the research process a little bit, because research is such a weird thing, because in my own research, my own work, you research several million times more than you can possibly use in the book. But that's not like, never felt like wasted time, because even if I don't pull this fact from this spot of history and place it into the book, there's still the web of thinking about the subject, my brain grows with every little thing I'm doing. And even if it never gets typed in, even if it gets used, that's still really, really useful. So just roughly, how much made it into your manuscript from your research versus how much got left out?
Actually, I think most of it wound up in there one way or another, either very specifically or through the way a scene was set or the way somebody talked about something. Certainly there was a lot of sifting through redundant information and figuring out what was the most important, distilling all of that information.
So turning to things like details, because one of the things that makes historical fiction, I think, really resonate is when there's concrete specific details, and that's certainly the case in this book. How did you research things like detail and setting as opposed to characters and events and dates and things like that?
Well, certainly researched a lot of things that had words, but then there was travel. So as I mentioned, we went to Hiroshima, we went to Hawaii, we've been to the Japanese American Museum in Los Angeles, to the Smithsonian, to the National Archives, where we were able to pull Kent's family's files. That was a truly remarkable experience. So travel and museums and the like, but then also photography. One of Dorothea Lange's photographs of this very famous photograph of a little Japanese American girl wearing tag around her neck, holding a little suitcase, waiting to go off to camp, is what I was looking at the Baltimore Museum of Art when Kent told me that was his mother's story. So photography, is very powerful to me. And I have access to some things that are pretty hard to find. So for example, this book here, you can see at the top, maybe it's written in Japanese, and then underneath of it, it says The Reconstruction of Hiroshima. So this book was published in Japan. It's written in Japanese, but it's filled with photographs of the remains of the city. And then, what was there before. And so a book like this was just gold for me to be able to imagine, what that A-bomb, the dome building that's so famous. We saw it a lot a few weeks ago, with when the G7 was there. What was that building used for? It was used for lots of different things. There were vendors in there and buy oysters in there and harps and all kinds of things in that building, and then there's nothing now but this eerie shell.
Yeah, I know when I was researching, I also found there's a comic book, a manga, Barefoot Gen, and it was by a Hiroshima survivor. And it's one of the most devastating looks at it because it's a very simple cartooning style. But when you render horrors in a very simple cartooning style, it's almost like more stark. These simple black and white images of, how gory you want to get, but like the renderings and historically personal firsthand account of their experience in Hiroshima. So yeah, absolutely finding the little research treasures that allow you to inhabit the space are so important. So that the book I didn't know the book you just showed, and I'm like, oh, that's amazing. That would have been so helpful when I was in that research process.
This is in my father-in-law's library in his collection.
Great. Oops, I lost my place. So one question with the researching process is, how much research did you do before you started writing, maybe before you thought you could start writing, versus how much were you doing as you were writing, and then maybe even in revision when you're going back through, realizing there are places you need to flesh out? Where did the research fall in your writing process, before, during, after, and how much maybe of each?
Yes, and yes.
Yes.
But seriously, Hiroshima was the first area that I took on. And so there's 52 different sources for that research. And I organized it in a spreadsheet. So, you saw this. You should see my spreadsheets for research. But that spreadsheet for Hiroshima is 64 pages long. And it's organized, the columns are the topic, the source, and then my notes. And then when that was complete, and then we went to Japan, and we were in Hiroshima, came home and wrote the early Hiroshima chapters, and actually wrote up to the point that the war is over. Mm-hmm. And Koji comes back to the United States. And then after that, moved on to the incarceration. And it was the same process, except over 80 sources and over 141 pages in the spreadsheet. And then writing those early chapters for Ruby. So they were written completely separate. It wasn't linear, just moving through time with those characters, because the experiences were so very different. And then pulling together the rest of the book when they eventually meet and whatnot.
I hope you take this comment as admiration, but that is absurd. That is so absurd. The amount of work there, that is, oh, wow. And I feel like, I'm a fairly deep researcher, but I don't write historical fiction specifically, so I maybe can get away without being as meticulous, because I don't necessarily need anything. I'm making things up in the end, so I don't necessarily need anything fine, but that is such an amazing process. And you maybe should write a craft book next on the process of researching historical fiction, because that's, explain how you do your spreadsheets, explain all that stuff. It would be really fascinating.
But, just by having it in the spreadsheet and being able to sort it by topic, it made it so much easier. Mm-hmm. Because then I actually cut all this up and put it on these big flip chart pages. And I think for the incarceration, I had a 7-foot island in my house at that point, and the flip charts went down my island, multiple times, like 3-4 times, 7 feet times like 4. That's how many flip charts there were. But it was all taped down by topic, and it was all there at a glance. So it actually took all this and just kind of brought it in a way that it was manageable, and I could use it to write from.
Well, we're getting near the end, so I have a couple of questions I do want to hit before we finish. And the first one is, what's next? You've tackled this one project. It was your first project and so far your only project. I'm really interested. And you said you bounced around from job to job. Are we sticking with writing for something else?
I think so. Yeah, I definitely have the bug now. One of the things that I've learned is how wonderful this writing community is. I've made such great friends, and everyone is so supportive of one another, and that's very different from working in big companies and working in interior design. Very different, and it's just a vibe that I absolutely love. I am thinking about adapting the book for middle grade, but that's, a whole new area.
Well, that would be fantastic, though.
to
You have my
explore.
support in that project. So
Yeah, I don't know about the appropriateness of it for middle grade. It's something that I need to think about and get some expert advice on.
I mean, I'm not an expert in middle grade, but my initial gut reaction is, oh God, that needs to be a middle grade book. That would be so important and I think appreciated by not just educators, but by the middle grade readers themselves. All right, well, we're very much at the end right now, so I do want to ask the last question, which is the last question we like to ask all our writers. What's one piece of advice you'd offer to a writer just starting out on a nonfiction book similar to yours? Other than get lots of spreadsheets.
Yeah, well, I don't know that it applies to books like mine. I think it applies to any kind of writing. And that is that, writers have, let's say you have this much time in your day. That's it. You have a circle of time. Maybe it's all day. This was my full-time job. So this was all day, every day for me. So my circle was really big. Other people only have an hour or two, if that, for their writing because they have full-time jobs. But I think it's important that if you're writing a book and your goal is to publish that book, that whatever time you have for writing, you divide it and only take half of that time for research and writing the book. And then the other half of that circle divided by 2 and spend 50% of your time writing, 25% of your time learning the business of publishing. Don't wait until you're ready to publish a book. Begin to learn it early on and figuring out how you're going to maneuver it and what your goals are for the book and where you fit within that industry. And then the other 25% of your time becoming a good literary citizen, showing up, supporting people, because everybody starts somewhere. And I am so grateful to the people that took me by the hand. And, I recognized early on the importance of it. It's not about networking to further your book sales. It's about becoming a part of a community where you're making a difference and you are strengthening one another. Yeah, and you show up.
Yeah, you're there because you want to be there. And if you're not wanting to be there, it's maybe not the right business to be in. So yeah. Absolutely. Connie, thank you so much for sharing all this. Thanks to everyone who came out and who is watching this video now in the future. Please, if you're able, get a copy of the book of White Ashes by Constance Hays Matsumoto and Kent Matsumoto. And if you can't get a copy there, you can always go to your local library and ask them to get a copy as well. Any way you can support the authors and read their books is the best thing you can possibly do for the universe. So Connie, thank you again so much for joining us, and hopefully we're going to see you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Have a good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Thanks so much.